皆様、本日はお忙しい中、プラネットトラッカーによる日本の水産業に関する最新報告書の発表説明会へご参加いただきまして、誠にありがとうございます。私は本日の進行を務めさせていただきます、アシュトンコンサルティングの林と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。本日はプラネットトラッカーより、リサーチディレクターのジョン・ウィリスと、金融アナリストのフランソワ・モニエが登壇いたします。お時間になりましたので、早速ですが、発表説明会を開催させていただきます。まず、注意事項といたしまして、本日の説明会は同時通訳で進めさせていただきます。Zoom の同時通訳機能をお使いいただくため、ウェブブラウザや音声通話ではなく、Zoom アプリからの入室をお願いいたします。まだの方がいらっしゃいましたら、ただいまの時間でアプリから再入していただくようお願いいたします。オンラインでの開催となりますが、スクリーンショットなど自由に撮っていただいて結構です。また、画面の撮影などもしていただいて構いません。本日使用いたしますプレゼンテーション資料は、イベント終了後に出席者の皆様にメールにてお送りいたしますので、後ほどご参照いただけますと幸いです。本日の流れを簡単にご説明させていただきます。まずは、リサーチディレクターのジョン・ウィリスと金融アナリストのフランソワ・モニエにより、最新報告書の概要や調査結果などについてお話しいたします。その後、質疑応答の時間を設けて閉会となります。本日の発表会でのご質問の受け付け方についてご説明させていただきます。今回は Zoom のチャット機能を用いてご質問を受け付けます。チャット機能は画面下のバーにありますチャットを選んでいただけますとご利用いただけます。こちらのチャットから御社名、ご氏名を添えてご質問内容をお送りください。発表会の途中にお送りいただいて結構でございます。なお、時間の都合上、お答えできる質問に限りがございますので、どうかご了承くださいませ。次に、同時通訳機能についてご説明させていただきます。先ほども申し上げましたが、同時通訳機能をお使いいただくため、ご出席される皆様には Zoom アプリから入室をお願いしております。同時通訳機能は画面下のバーにあります通訳を選んでいただけますとご利用いただけます。こちらの言語設定で日本語を選択してください。それでは最新報告書の発表説明会を開始させていただきます。John and Francois, please start your presentation when you are ready.
Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to listen to us. This is much appreciated. I am John Willis, the Director of Research at Planet Tracker. Planet Tracker is a not-for-profit financial think tank, and our goal is to align investor capital with planetary limits. Today, I would like to present the findings of our new report called Against the Tide, written by Francois Monnier, financial analyst in our Oceans team. Firstly, I would like to explain why we wrote this report. If you look at this chart, you will see that global stock markets trended up in the last few years, while the state of marine biodiversity continued to deteriorate. This shows that financial markets have largely ignored the degradation of nature, on the assumption that this is largely irrelevant to the company's financials. With this report, we want to show that the depletion of the natural world does impact financials. We took an entire sector of a G7 economy, that is, the seafood industry in Japan, as a case study. As you can see, the degradation of ocean health in Japan did not impact the local financial markets either. You may remember our earlier research paper called Perfect Storm, written in late 2019. Planet Tracker showed that rebuilding sustainable stocks of wild catch fish could transform the Japanese seafood industry, increase profits, preserve its reputation, and reduce financial risk to investors. In this new report, we show, firstly, why the decline in seafood consumption, production, and imports has been largely overlooked by investors in these Japanese companies. Secondly, how those natural constraints impacted financial and what measures management teams have taken to counter declining seafood resources. And finally, how more sustainability could drive an improvement in financial indicators in a way which is aligned to nature's constraints that these corporates face. I would now like to hand over to my colleague, Francois Meunier, who will explain the analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us today. Let's start with a brief overview of the natural capital context. There are a series of factors that contribute to the deterioration of marine resources. The biggest one is overfishing, but there are others. Ghost fishing, when abandoned fishing gear in the sea continue to catch fish. Bycatch, when unwanted fish or marine animals are caught by accident, etc. All of these factors are interconnected, but the diagram here shows you how we think about them and how, for instance, the depletion of wild stocks affects the industry's transition to aquaculture, which itself has impact on marine habitats. In the note, we talk in detail about these issues. In this context, it is not a surprise to see declining numbers across the board for seafood in Japan. Wild catch numbers are down, consumption is down, and also interestingly, imports are down and aquaculture output too. The main reason why imports are down is because the imports of small pelagic fish, so fish meal, which is called other fish in the chart on the right, in the top corner, is going down massively. It is a category that is large in volume terms, which more than offsets the growth seen in salmon imports, for instance. So what we did is to try to understand how this decline in marine resources affected companies that are dependent on seafood. We looked at all companies on the Tokyo Stock Exchange and kept 70 companies where at least a portion of revenue is connected to seafood. Together, they have combined revenue of 45 trillion yen and a market cap of 12 trillion yen. We then split them in 7 subsectors. Seafood producer, which include fishing companies, aquaculture, and processing companies, for instance, like Maruwa Nichiro. Food producers, which include companies similar to seafood producers, but for which seafood is not the main business, like Nichirei. Feed producers, like Feed One. Seafood retailers and wholesalers, like Chuo Gyoryu. Food retailers and wholesalers, again, similar to seafood retailers and wholesalers, but for which seafood is not the main business, like Nishimoto. Restaurant, but only those significantly exposed to seafood, like Uoki. And conglomerates, like Marubeni. And when you analyze the financials of companies exposed to seafood in Japan, what you notice is unexpected. Growth across the board. 2% sales growth per year on average, and profits and market caps have substantially grown too. The green bars on each chart here shows the aggregated net income per subsector, and the lines are the combined market cap. This is true for the overall sector, but also seafood producers specifically, food producers, feed producers, seafood retailers and wholesalers, food retailers and wholesalers, conglomerates. The only exception is restaurant. We will come back on that later. The question then is, how is that possible? How do companies operating in a fragmented market grow sales and profit when seafood volumes are down? The chart here describes the revenue strategies used in each subsector, where on the left, you have subsectors with a low exposure to seafood, like conglomerates, and on the right, those with a high exposure to seafood. At the top, you have producers, so the beginning of the supply chain, and at the bottom, retailers, wholesalers, and restaurants, the end of the supply chain. We found overall that two main factors supported revenue growth: mergers and acquisitions, M&A, and foreign expansion, which are to be put in the context of domestic growth. Strategies differ across subsectors. For instance, conglomerates face a decline in domestic sales, so they use significant M&A and enjoy strong growth abroad. And if you compare food retailers with a low exposure to seafood retailers with a high exposure, you see interesting differences as well. Moving down the P&L, what is noticeable is that the reason why net profits have grown is not because gross margins have grown. It is often the opposite, especially in the subsectors highly exposed to seafood. But whilst gross margin typically deteriorated, EBITDA margins fared better, which illustrates two trends: vertical integration and cost optimization. You can see in the table here how non-production costs declined as a percentage of sales across the board. Non-production costs are costs that are not directly linked to the production of seafood products, for instance, marketing or administrative costs. And the second thing is that macroeconomic conditions helped those companies. Interest rates decreased, that is the green line on the chart, and at the same time, leverage ratios decreased too, the orange line. The trends are the same across subsectors. And of course, foreign exchange helped too, with the yen weakening against the dollar. Just to illustrate these trends, let's take a quick look at Nisui. Over the last 10 years, most of the revenue growth of that company came from abroad, and M&A added up to 20% to revenue. Gross margins went down by 3 percentage points, but as the group got even more vertically integrated, EBIT margins rose by almost the same magnitude. This, coupled with strong decline in interest costs, helped net profit and share price growth. The problem of these strategies is that they have their limits. It is true that mergers and acquisitions can continue for a long time, given how fragmented the sector is. So that is a tool that can be used in the long term. And so is foreign expansion. Vertical integration, however, will eventually be limited. At some point, you cannot get more integrated. Cost cutting also has its limits. There's only so much that you can cut. And it can backfire when you look at what happened to Kraft Heinz, for instance. Further deleveraging now is difficult because leverage ratios are already low and interest costs are already at rock bottom. And in addition, when you dig deeper in the financials, there are many converging signs that the degradation of nature has started to hit them. Let's have a look. Even before the COVID crisis, seafood restaurants were struggling in Japan, They were the only subsector with negative EBIT margins in our universe, and those margins went down as sales deteriorated, leading to declining returns. Turning to seafood retailers and wholesalers, like restaurants, their revenue have been hit by declining seafood volumes. Their domestic revenue went down by 1% a year on average. So what did these companies do? They invested more. Capital expenditure at seafood retailers and wholesalers has more than doubled as a percentage of sales between 2010 and 2019. The typical investment is in warehousing capacity for products other than seafood, like Yokorei has been doing. The result is that seafood retailers and wholesalers are not able to cover the costs of their investment through their operational cash flow alone and have to use debt. Turning to seafood producers, the key here we think is gross margins. That is the margins before non-production costs. For seafood producers, they are 12 percentage points lower than for food producers also producing seafood. The same is true, by the way, when you compare gross margins of seafood retailers and wholesalers to those of food retailers and wholesalers, a 12 percentage point gap as well. Now, gross margins at seafood producers are a function of several things, but a key factor is seafood prices. For instance, Maruha Nichiro said in 2016 that margins rose as fish price rose, and in 2019 that margin declined because of low prices for skipjack, crab, and salmon. So when prices are coming down, margins tend to decrease too. And overall, during the 2010 to 2019 period, prices went down. So I have just presented here a few illustrations showing how companies exposed to seafood are seeing their financials impacted by natural capital constraints. The diagram here recaps some of these trends, looking at a universe of 70 companies. For each sector, we put in red trends that are negative, in green trends that are positive, and in black what is neutral. What jumps to the eye immediately is that companies the most exposed to seafood, such as pure play seafood producer, retailers, and wholesalers, are those that suffer the most. Again, that doesn't mean that headline numbers such as revenue or net profits are declining, but that the fundamentals are perhaps deteriorating. What does it mean for financial markets? For equity investors, the most obvious risk is derating. The EV to EBIT multiple of seafood producers went down from 18 times to 14 times between 2010 and 2019, whilst the same multiple of food producers expanded by the same magnitude. Similar trends are noticeable at retailers and wholesalers. For lenders and bond investors, the risk is different. 89% of the sector's debt is not due before 2030, as you can see on this chart. And as you can see on the right, companies the most exposed to seafood, producers and retailers, have the longest debt maturities. This means that these companies have made commitments to refund fixed amounts of money in the next decade and beyond, whilst visibility on fish production and therefore profit generation in 2030 and beyond is very limited. Bearing in mind these risks and constraints, we have tried to find another path. To find out how equity investors could help improve sustainability in the Japanese seafood sector, we have isolated the drivers of share price performance for companies in our universe. The idea was to then research how these drivers could be improved in a way that is aligned with natural capital constraints. We found out that the key drivers of share price performance within our universe were revenue growth, change in EBIT margin, growth in operating cash flow, growth in returns, whether return on assets or returns on capital employed, and expansion or compression in valuation multiples, such as PE or EV/EBIT. None of these metrics allows to assess natural capital management, but let's see how each of these can be grown in a way that is aligned with natural capital constraints. This is a summary of our recommended strategies. Some of them can be deployed quickly and without major investment, for instance, disclosing seafood volumes by species and by origin. Some of them, like reducing ghost fishing or developing certified products, aim at growing revenue over the medium term. Others, like implementing traceability solutions, aim at improving margins and returns, as we already discussed in a previous report called Traceable Returns. A more drastic and very challenging idea would be to participate in a blue bond scheme, where companies accept to fish less temporarily to help fish stocks regenerate. The loss in cash flow would be covered by investors who would be repaid by fishing companies once fish stocks recover. We also covered this in previous research. Let me briefly talk about 3 recommendations, and then I will stop. A key existing driver of revenue growth is innovations in the industry. Now, the problem is that these new products are not typically marketed as being sustainable. So one radical idea could be to invest in lab-grown and plant-based seafood. This is already a thing in the US or elsewhere. For instance, Nestle launched a plant-based tuna, but also in Japan. What you can see here are vegan scallops launched by Cargill in Japan. Below that, a bluefin tuna grown in a lab. I know this might sound extreme, but in the long term, the risk of the status quo is to see increased competition, the same way the likes of Beyond Meat are already competing against the beef industry. For feed producers, a foray into sustainable feeds, using only deforestation-free soy, for instance, could be a strong growth driver too. Turning to cash flow, a different idea, one effective idea would be to reduce food waste. Working capital requirements have increased in all subsectors between 2010 and 2019, and that was purely driven by inventories. Reducing food waste across the supply chain would help improve cash generation. This table shows you the cash impact for each sector of the increase in days of inventories over the period. Reducing food waste could effectively drive down that wasted cash. Some companies like Maruha Nichiro and Nisui already have quantified plans. Lastly, and perhaps to finish on the most controversial recommendation, let's have a look at capital employed. Despite the reduction in debt, capital employed went up, and we explained that with higher asset intensity at investment made abroad and aquaculture. These assets, though, are generating high growth. However, there is an asset that does not generate very high growth, and that is also carrying high sustainability risks. That is bottom trawler. Bottom trawlers have been banned in multiple places across the world already because of the way they disrupt marine habitats. And a recent study claimed that bottom trawlers generate as much carbon emissions as the entire global aviation. Of course, bottom trawlers generate a significant proportion of revenue. We estimate between 5 and 10% for Nisui, for instance. But the question is, wouldn't it make more sense to gradually retire and write off part or all of bottom trawling fleets to reduce sustainability risks and become more asset light at the same time? Now, if we bring all of these recommendations together, what are the expected impacts? How will they actually affect the 5 key financial indicators we discussed before? Well, as you can see, their impact is generally positive, both financially, that is the second column in the table here, and for nature, the third column. For instance, by reducing food waste, you drive overfishing down, bring your costs and your cash flow up as you free working capital, and you are seen as more sustainable. So it should improve your valuation multiples too. So once again, as a conclusion, the point of our report was to show that the state of nature and the financials of companies are interconnected. And that even though management have been doing very well in coming up with strategies to offset this natural constraint, the status quo might no longer be possible. That's why we suggested a few ways to grow key financial metrics in a way that is aligned with nature. We believe that if those recommendations are followed, investors will continue to reward management. This concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Francois, thank you very much for sharing this very interesting research with us. May I also take this opportunity to thank our funders who financed the analysis in this report, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the Finance Hub, the Oak Foundation, and the Levine Family Foundation. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them to us through the chat function. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, John and Francois. それでは質疑応答に移らせていただきたいと思います。冒頭でご質問はチャット機能からと申し上げましたが、ご質問のある方は Q&A からお願いいたします。大変失礼いたしました。画面の下の方にあります Q&A ボタンから、クリックしていただきますと入力画面が出てきますので、御社名、ご氏名を添えてお願いいたします。それでは、プレゼン中にいただいておりましたご質問からお答えさせていただきます。今回のプラネットトラッカーの報告で、水産物の供給量が何年間も減少している中で、投資家はそのことに関心を払っていなかったとありましたが、これは正しい反応と言えるのでしょうか。回答をお願いいたします。
Thank you for the questions. I can try to attempt to answer that one. It's a good question. I think if you are a shareholder with a long-term investment horizon, or if you're a bondholder or a lender with a long-term horizon again, no, I think that was not the right answer. Of course, management did a good job at making up for the impact of depleting natural resources. But as we saw in the presentation, even though headline numbers are good, the fundamentals have deteriorated. And because there are limits to strategies used to bypass natural constraints, sooner or later, the deterioration of fundamentals will show up if nothing is done. Now, of course, we cannot blame stock markets for rewarding these companies. As we saw, the key financial indicators stock markets participants care about and disclosed by company are not linked to nature. That is why we think it's very important to adapt financial reporting so that it includes nature-related indicators. For instance, seafood volumes by species and location, sales by species, status of the fish stocks used, etc. And this way, management and financial markets would be aligned with nature.
ありがとうございます。 続きまして、次の質問に移らせていただきます。水産物の供給量は減少しているにもかかわらず、企業の経営者たちは M&A や海外進出など、成長力を保つためにあらゆる戦略を取ってきたと説明されていましたが、経営者はこういった戦略を取り続けることはできないのでしょうかと質問いただいております。お願いいたします。
Yeah, I mean, that is a fair question. So just to recap, there are 5 strategies that we identified, right? There was M&A, and yes, this can continue, of course, but it's relatively risky. There's always execution risk. Foreign expansions, of course, that can continue too. But remember that ever-growing requirements in terms of sustainability in foreign markets and in Western markets in particular mean that Japanese companies have to keep improving sustainability to penetrate and be competitive in those markets. The last 3 strategies, well, we had vertical integrations, but there are limits as to how much integrated a company can be. Once you're fully vertically integrated, you can no longer be more integrated. Cost cutting, there are limits as well. Now, if you cut costs too much and you underinvest, you lose market share and you underperform. This is what happened, as I said before, to Kraft Heinz, for instance, in the US. The last strategy were cutting interest costs and debt level. Well, in seafood exposed companies, both are already very low, so it will be hard to cut further. So in short, the answer is that it cannot continue like this because there are limits to these strategies. And, you know, once again, management are incentivized to grow a series of financial indicators, which are typically the ones stock markets care about. So if management compensation perhaps was also partly linked to nature-related metrics, most likely management strategies would surely be more aligned with nature too.
Sorry, can I just add something here? Because I think it's a very, very good question. Of the 5 strategies that Francois outlined, you're absolutely right. You know, can they all continue forever? And the 2 that Francois has outlined as you can continue, mergers and acquisitions and foreign expansion, I think it's worth emphasizing that those are the 2 most risky strategies. So all management teams will know who are listening that you are being left with the 2 most risky strategies to allow for the continued expansion of the company's profits. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。続きまして、続いての質問参ります。各種軽減は、財務的にもメリットが期待できるようですが、こうした各種政策の導入を阻む要因はどこにあると思われますかとご質問いただきました。お願いいたします。
Which policies exactly? Sorry, I'm not sure I understood. Which policies? Unless John, maybe have you understood better?
So my understanding, sorry, can we just, to make sure we answer the question, can I just clarify the question that was being asked? Is the question, which is the best strategies to follow? We just need to clarify the question. Thank you.
こちらスライドに提示されていた表の提言ということで理解いただければと思います。いかがでしょうか。
Sorry, thank you very much, and apologies, we misunderstood the question. So the question is, of all the strategies proposed, what is stopping those all being continued? So Francois, why can't I just continue cutting costs? Why can't I continue just deleveraging?
So yeah, thank you, John, and sorry about that. What I understood is within the strategies that we propose, what is preventing management to adopt those strategies? And I think, as always, when it's investment that is about aligning with nature, there's an element of time. So most of these strategies require an investment upfront, which will then pay off over time. For instance, traceability is seen often as a cost. Now, we demonstrated that actually it is a profitable investment, but it is up to management to change the perception on these strategies if you want, and if you're not convinced that indeed investing in a traceability solution, for instance, will pay off, then probably you will not do it. Some others, for some strategies, for instance, they are complicated. For instance, the most extreme example was the blue bond scheme that we talked about. This is very challenging, very complicated, and require lots of coordination. So of course, that's perhaps the most challenging of all. But for some of them are actually very easy. So disclosing seafood volumes, it's probably information that management have anyway. It's just not disclosed because they're not forced to. No one asked them to. But that would help investors tremendously because they would understand how the natural capital these companies rely on, in which state the natural capital this company rely on is. So I think, yeah, sorry, it's a long answer, but there are many different factors here.
Can I just add a couple of points to what Francois has said? We recognize that you can continue with mergers and acquisitions, that you can continue with foreign expansion, but as we've discussed, these are high risk. So the options that you have is to continue with the other strategies. So if we look at the practical side, you could say, well, I am able as a management team to continue with vertical integration. Our point would be, once you have purchased, for example, a seafood processor, once you have purchased a seafood wholesaler, once you have purchased a seafood retailer, what is then the option? You are now vertically integrated. Your only option is to keep expanding. On cost cutting, I think Francois gave a good example that a company can go too far. Of course, management teams are very skilled at getting this balance of return, but there have been examples that you can see around the world where someone starts cost cutting and they go too far. So the obvious example is you say, I want to cut more costs, so I will reduce my sales force. And the obvious impact of that can be, as the sales force reduces, you sell less. I'm not saying that will definitely happen, but it's a possibility. And then, especially in the present environment, cutting interest costs when interest costs are very, very low, what do you now do? You then start to build up the cash because you've reduced your debt. You build up the cash. You're not getting much return on that cash. It sort of encourages you to go back to M&A and foreign expansion again. So that was what we were trying to explain. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。続いての質問に参ります。乱獲だけではなく、気候変動の影響によっても、捕獲できる魚の種類が目まぐるしく変わってくることも日本の水産業に大きく影響を与えると思います。そこで投資家 はこの点をどのように配慮すればいいでしょうか。また、水産業におけるトランジションファイナンスはどういうものが考えられるかお答えください。
So in terms of climate change impact, that is even more difficult perhaps than addressing the depletion in natural capital resources, because for instance, overfishing or other man-made problems like those, we can actually we can mitigate those risks if you want. Climate change, the Japanese seafood industry on its own cannot mitigate climate change, sadly. But of course, it can adapt. So often what would happen for seafood industry specifically is that it will result in a change in the temperature in water or acidification of oceans, which mean that some species that typically used to be found somewhere will then migrate to other waters. So it's about adapting to strategies. And then because this can be predicted by science with more or less accuracy, of course, you can use some financial instruments if you want to readapt your strategies to fish differently, if that makes sense. But perhaps John has a different view.
Yeah, on the issue of finance, I think that's really interesting because it depends how you are financing these companies. So what we believe going forward is that if I take the equity investor, the shareholder, they are becoming more and more selective in the companies that they are buying into. And we think that you will see this play out in the ratings will change between those that are seen to be adopting a very good strategy and those that are seen to be following, perhaps. So we think there will be a bigger range in ratings going forward. What is really interesting is on the debt side. And as Francois demonstrated, actually, a lot of these companies are well financed and they have loans due over a very long period. For those banks and those that have made the loans, on the loan side, actually, it's difficult for them to get out. They have to wait for that maturity. So to be honest, it depends where you are in the financial capital structure. But for those companies, and we're seeing these companies, we are seeing management teams of these companies. A number of them have been very, very clever and successful in what they are doing. The warning we are trying to convey to people is that some of those options are now starting to be closed down. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。それでは続いての質問に参ります。漁船数の削減に伴って経営効率と雇用数のトレードオフについて分析があればお聞かせください。日本の保守的な漁業政策関係者の間では、経営効率と漁労雇用数はトレードオフの関係にある。経営効率が悪くとも、より多くの漁業者の雇用が残せることが正しい。経営効率が上がっても漁業者が失業するなら許されないといった価値観が強いです。一方で、おっしゃったような漁船の削減によって漁業が経営を改善し、投資を呼び、資源を回復して、加工流通業の規模を大きくできる可能性もあります。つまり、漁船を減らした方が、むしろ漁村に加工流通の雇用が増えるという状況もあり得ます。このように漁船数の減少が必ずしも雇用の減少につながらないという可能性について、具体的な事例や定量的な分析はありますか？
Thank you very much for that question. And to be honest, it's a really relevant question. These are excellent questions. A really relevant question, because one of the things that we do look at in Planet Tracker is the social impact of these changes, what we would call a just transition. In other words, we accept it is very easy for think tanks and NGOs to say, close this, do this, and not think about the effect on people. Your point about can you reduce, and I'll ask Francois in a moment, can you reduce your harvesting, your wild catch, your aquaculture, and increase your, if you like, your value added processing? There certainly are examples where that has happened around the world. We were just looking, for example, at one of the European countries, Denmark, in fact, which now has developed a more significant fish processing, which a number of those companies believe is more value added. So they have seen some employment move from the harvesting, from the catching side, further down the supply chain to the processing side, which they view as more value added. Francois, I don't know if there's more points you'd like to add.
No, I think it was a great question that captured many elements. And yes, it is true, the reference to the declining number of vessels over the last 10 years and even longer periods in Japan, both the number of vessels and the total tonnage at these shipping vessels is coming down. And as we showed, actually sales of the seafood producers and conglomerates mostly that own those vessels is going up. And so that shows effectively that, yes, with fewer vessels and even fewer fish caught, companies managed to increase their sales, and processing was the key answer, key strategy used. So moving downstream, effectively generating more yen per kilogram of fish. But as you become, like John said, if you invest heavily into processing, because staff is going to be such a high cost at these processing companies, that creates the incentive to move your processing facilities in lower income countries, with a consequence on employment as well. So yeah, just to add that, you know, it's everything is connected in a way, so it's a difficult one to answer.
ありがとうございます。続いての質問です。先ほどトランジションファイナンスについて聞いたのですが、もう少し詳しく聞かせていただければと思います。もう一度質問を繰り返させていただきます。気候変動の分野ではトランジションファイナンスが注目を集めていますが、水産業におけるトランジションファイナンスはどういうものが考えられるかお答えいただければと思います。
Thank you very much for this question. This is very interesting because transition finance is very new in, if I may call the oceans, the blue economy. This is very new. And in fact, to help facilitate discussions about the risks and reward about this type of financing, I would recommend you to go and read Rising Tide by UNEP, FI, who's just released a whole framework to help that. So I hope you will take the opportunity to look at that. Let me explain how new this is, but I think it's very, very exciting. We wrote a note not so long ago called Bonds for Ponds. And we wrote this towards the end of last year, and we were highlighting to people who read our research that these were the first well, they called them green bonds, actually, not even blue bonds. But these were the first bonds being issued by seafood companies. So this is just last year, but the first bonds being issued by seafood companies linked to sustainability issues. In this particular case, it was in relation to the feed that they were supplying in aquaculture, in fish farming. That's it. Now, you're also seeing the emergence of blue bonds. Now, many people know that the World Bank sponsored a blue bond a couple of years ago in the Seychelles. Then everything went quiet. And more recently, you have seen China issue a couple of blue bonds. I will ask Francois to talk about the blue bonds that we're referring to, but there's just one other issue. What is the latest development in this area are not sustainability bonds, but sustainability linked bonds. And what the market is saying, what financiers and investors are saying is, we will allow you to pay a lower interest rate if you meet sustainability targets. And that really is quite exciting. It is very, very new indeed. It started to appear in other sectors. For example, it's appeared in the textile sectors. And if you would like examples, please don't hesitate to contact us. But I just want to return to the blue bond that we were proposing, because that's just slightly different and linked to fish stock. Francois, could you just explain that, please?
Yeah, thank you, John. And that's the answer I had in mind as well. Just quickly on sustainability linked bonds. This one is actually an example that is already proven. Thai Union issued one recently, including through Japanese banks actually and Japanese investors, which shows there's an appetite in the Japanese market for this element. And very quickly, it allows the company to have lower interest rates if it improves a set of sustainability criteria. So that's very interesting. Now, the blue bond example we had in mind, let's be honest, it's much more challenging, and it's not been implemented yet. So it is a theoretical concept that we would like to progress. The idea is to start from the realization that the key issue is overfishing. And the simple but difficult answer to reducing overfishing is simply to fish less. Now, that will obviously affect the profit and the cash flow of companies that fish. So an answer would be for investors to make up for that loss of cash flow by paying seafood companies upfront for fishing less effectively. And then after a few years, as the fish stocks recover, and there are lots of examples showing that they can recover quite quickly, fish companies would be authorized, if you want, to fish more again and repay part of the and repay investors a coupon based on how much fish they caught. And in our example, which we wrote in the research last year, we can show that this is a tool that is both profitable for investors, extremely value creative for companies, and that helps the state of fish stocks. Of course, there are many challenges, so I don't want to go too much into detail here, but it would be who issues the bond and how do we agree on quota, etc. So that is a difficult example, but we think that if the industry goes towards this kind of transition finance instrument, it can effectively solve overfishing.
ありがとうございました。いただいた質問は以上となりますが、追加のご質問ございますでしょうか。よろしいですかね。はい、それでは、こちらをもちまして、パラネットトラッカーの最新報告書 発表説明会を終了いたします。追加のご質問やご依頼がある方は、E メールにて弊社アシュトンコンサルティングまでご連絡いただけましたら、追ってご連絡させていただきます。本日は誠にありがとうございました。今後ともどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。